It's just after midnight at the Wellington Air Traffic Control Centre on December the 21st, 1978. The room is dim, the light kept low so the radar screens stay readable, so the green glow of the sweeps doesn't wash out in overhead fluorescence. There's a half-eaten Afghan biscuit lying next to an equally neglected crossword puzzle. The small accumulated debris of a long night shift stretching out toward morning. John Cordy is 53 years old. He's a former RAF radar operator. He spent 8 years as a senior controller here in Wellington, and he has the particular stillness of someone who spent decades watching these screens. It's a trained patience, a practiced calm. He's a man not prone to jumping to anything like a conclusion without conclusive data to support his thinking. And in all of the years he's been doing this job, he's never seen anything like he's seen on those screens for the past 3 hours. For the first time in his career, it feels like something has been watching him back. It first appeared at 9:10. It was a radar return that he didn't recognise. It was sitting in airspace where nothing should be sitting. He checked the flight plans. There was nothing scheduled. He checked again, thorough and diligent as always, and still nothing. He called across to a colleague and pointed at the screen. His colleague leaned in, squinted at the green trace, said nothing for a long moment. He just scrunched up his face and shook his head in a slow silence. Because there it was, solid, clear, the kind of return you would expect from an aircraft, a real physical object bouncing the radar pulse back to the receiver with a clean authority. And yet there's no corroborating data to suggest that there should be any aircraft there. For the next 3 hours, Cordy watches it come and go. Sometimes it sits motionless for up to 40 minutes. And sometimes it moves. Not drifting, not the soft wandering of a weather balloon caught in the wind, but purposeful, lateral movement. It's controlled, deliberate. And then it just vanishes from the screen entirely, and then returns. And by midnight, there are 5 of them. Cordy's calm demeanour is wearing noticeably thin. He desperately needs some confirmation that he's not losing his mind. He picks up the phone and calls the Blenheim flight service. He reads them the coordinates and asks them to check with Woodburn. At RNZ-AF Woodburn Base, 18 kilometres inland from the Kaikoura coast, an officer is doing paperwork at the duty desk. The base is quiet. It's past midnight and there's nothing particularly remarkable about this shift. That is, of course, until that call comes through from Blenheim. The officer chats with them for a few minutes, taking notes, growing increasingly perplexed by the situation they're presenting him. At the end of the call, he decides the only course of action, the only way to solve this puzzle, will be to go and check the night sky with his own eyes. He picks up his mug, coffee, starting to go cold. He's been on the phone for a little while, and the skin's beginning to form on the top the way it does. He walks to the side door that opens out onto the apron, pushes it wide and steps out into the night. That Marlborough night in December is clear and extraordinary. There's no moon, but the stars are so dense, they seem almost load-bearing, as though the sky would collapse without them. The Kaikoura range is a dark mass to the south, blacker than the sky above it, and the officer stands there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, coffee mug in hand. And then he sees it, to the south, Above the ranges, a large white light, too large, too bright, too steady for a star. And it's flanked by two smaller ones. As he watches, the configuration changes. The lights shift. They move apart. They come together. There's nothing frantic about the movement. It's slow, considered, as though whatever is producing these lights is in no particular hurry and has no particular concern about being observed. In fact, it's almost as if they're performing for him. It's at about this time he remembers a discussion his colleagues were having the week prior about a young Australian pilot in a Cessna that vanished from the face of the earth in October. And as he recalls the conclusion to that story, the coffee mug tilts slightly in his hand. He doesn't even notice until the wet coffee starts to seep through his shoes. He rushes back inside and he calls Blenheim. Over the next 3 hours, cargo pilots who fly this route make visual contact with lights that match everything Cordy has on his screens. Everything the Woodburn officer saw with his own eyes. Multiple flights, multiple pilots. One crew will track a massive object cycling through red, white and orange that paces their aircraft for 40 miles. Their onboard instruments will clock its speed at 15,000 kilometres an hour. By morning, the phones at Wellington Air Traffic Control will not stop ringing. Police officers from the Hutt Valley are calling in. Residents from Kaikoura, from the Clarence Bridge settlement, from the coastal communities up and down the Kaikoura coast. People who stepped out to bring in the cat, or who couldn't sleep, or who happened to look up, and all of them are describing the same thing. It's front page news right across New Zealand. And over the ditch in Melbourne, at a television station called Channel Zero, a producer named Leonard Lee picks up his phone. Welcome to Struth, the podcast that normally goes looking for Australia's most baffling mysteries, the cases that don't close, the questions that don't settle, the stories that stay with you long after you've stopped listening. But today, as you've probably figured out already, we're doing something slightly different. This is the first ever episode of Struth Abroad, a new series of episodes that takes us beyond Australian shores to find the mysteries with that same quality of strangeness, that same refusal to be explained away. And just quickly, I'd like to thank all of my New Zealand listeners. There's plenty of Kiwis out there listening to Struth on a weekly basis, so this one's for you. I'd also like to mention that there are more episodes of Struth Abroad available right now to our premium subscribers. So you can kind of think of this one as a free preview. Next Wednesday, we'll be back to our regular Australian-based mysteries here, but I'll explain more about that and the premium subscription at the end of the episode. But let's get back to New Zealand, December 1978, because this is the story of the Kaikoura lights. The name comes from the Maori kai, meaning food, and kura, meaning crayfish. And the sea here does indeed give abundantly, because of what lies beneath it. A kilometre off the Kaikoura coast, the ocean floor drops from a few metres to over 1,500. The Kaikoura Canyon, a submarine abyss running parallel to the shore. It drives cold, nutrient-rich water upwards in a continuous upwelling. Sperm whales feed here year-round. The marine life is extraordinary, generated by an equally extraordinary piece of geography, as dramatic as any on Earth. And behind the coast, almost immediately, the mountains begin. the Kaikoura range rises to 2,600 metres, snow-capped, jagged, pressing the settlement into a narrow ribbon between rock and water. In 1978, there were fewer than 3,000 people living in the Kaikoura township. There's no major highways, very little to create light pollution. In fact, the night sky above this coast is rated Bortle 3 by astronomers, meaning that it's dark enough that the Milky Way casts a shadow. In 2024, it was officially designated an International Dark Sky Sanctuary, the perfect place to see strange things in the sky. It's also important to note that the cold water meeting the warm air above the canyon creates temperature inversions that can refract light in genuinely strange ways. In other words, the conditions here are tailor-made for misidentification. But the cargo pilots who flew this coast regularly knew that. This wasn't a misidentification. Something else was here on this particular night. And just 10 days later, they'd see it again. This time there'd be an Australian television camera crew with them. A bit of context to explain why the camera crew was there. On October 21st, 1978, 10 weeks earlier, Frederick Valentich, a 20-year-old Melbourne pilot, took off from Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne on a routine training flight to King Island in the middle of Bass Strait between Victoria and Tasmania. At 7:10 in the evening, he radioed the Melbourne Flight Service and described an unidentified craft above him. There were shining lights. It was something metallic and revolving. The radio operator asked him to identify it. Valentich simply replied, "It's not an aircraft." 17 seconds of metallic scraping sound were recorded on the open frequency. And then, nothing. Frederick Valentich and his Cessna were never found. The case remains officially unresolved to this day. And I promise we'll be covering it in a full future episode of Struth because it deserves its own time and its own telling. But it does help to explain why, in December 1978, Australian newspapers, radio stations and television networks were saturated with UFO coverage. The public appetite was enormous. So when New Zealand cargo pilots began reporting unexplained lights over the Kaikoura coast, lights tracked simultaneously on ground radar, the Australian media moved fast. At Channel Zero in Melbourne, which is now Channel 10, a New Zealand-born producer named Leonard Lee had a modest idea. He'd send a reporter on the regular cargo run, get a bit of background footage, interview the pilots and get them to describe their experience. It'd make for some good TV. He'd leverage off the enormous public interest at the time. The reporter Lee reached was Quinton Fogarty, 42 years old, Dunedin-born, currently on holiday in Christchurch. Lee also hired a local cameraman, Wellington freelancer David Crockett. He had a professional 16mm rig and a 240mm telephoto lens. And Crockett's wife, Nairi, came along as a sound recordist. The aircraft was a Safe Air Armstrong Whitworth Argosy, a 4-engine cargo freighter running a routine newspaper freight run from Wellington to Christchurch and back. At the controls of the plane, Captain Bill Startup. 23 years of flying, 14,000 hours in the air, and beside him, co-pilot Bob Gard, 7,000 hours, and the particular distinction of having already been in the cockpit on one of the earlier December flights when the lights were first reported. Gard had already seen something over this coast that he couldn't explain, and he was going back. This brings us to the 30th of December, 11:50 in the evening. Wellington Airport. The Argosy sat on the apron like the working-class freighter it was. Blunt-nosed, practical, built for carrying, not for elegance. And tonight's cargo was newspapers. Tomorrow's edition's bound for Christchurch, the kind of freight that won't wait. Fogarty, Crockett and Nairee stowed their equipment in the cabin. Crockett had lights, but out here, over a dark ocean, lights would be useless. The telephoto lens was their only real tool. Whatever they were going to find tonight, they were going to have to find it in the dark. At Wellington ATC, Air Traffic Control, the screens were already showing targets to the south. They had been, on and off, for 10 days. The Argosy lifted from Wellington at 11:50 and the night was extraordinary. Clear sky, visibility exceeding 30 nautical miles, stars from horizon to horizon. From altitude, the lights of Christchurch were visible 150 miles away. It was the kind of night where you can see everything that's up here with you. At 12:05 in the morning, Startup and Guard noticed lights near the Kaikoura coast, projecting downward beams, pulsing, and then disappearing. Fogarty and the Crocketts were summoned to the cockpit. Fogarty slowly pressed his face to the glass and saw, above the township, a row of bright pulsating lights he could not account for. Wellington came on the radio. Targets confirmed multiple returns. And yet the Argosy was the only registered aircraft south of Wellington. Crockett raised his camera. What happened over the next 45 minutes was documented in real time on Crockett's 16mm film. On a tape recorder running in the aircraft's cabin, on Wellington ground radar, on Christchurch radar, and on the aircraft's own instruments. It was also witnessed simultaneously by 7 people in the air and multiple controllers on the ground, making it one of the most corroborated UFO sightings in history. Controller Jeffrey Causa from Wellington reported targets at 12 o'clock, 10 miles, then 11 o'clock, 3 miles, then 9 o'clock, 2 miles. At that point he communicated to the cargo plane. There's a strong target right in formation with you. It could be right or left. And your target has doubled in size. Startup scanned the sky outside the windscreen. There was nothing visible, just clear air, stars. And yet in Wellington, the return on Causa's screen was as strong as the aircraft itself. And then all of a sudden there were blue, white lights flashing at a rapid rate. The pilots could see them now, strobing, consistent, completely unlike any aircraft they'd ever seen. In addition to the communications from Wellington, Christchurch's approach control came up on the radio, an independent radar station, 150 miles to the south. They too were tracking an unidentified return in the same position Causa was describing from Wellington. A return that would continue moving after the Argosy landed. Stop and think about that for a minute. 2 independent ground radar stations, as well as the aircraft's own equipment, with 7 eyewitnesses and 16mm colour film rolling. This wasn't a glitch. This was something real. The lights paced the cargo plane all the way to Christchurch, then turned south into the darkness over the Southern Ocean as the Argosy descended. It was 1:15 in the morning when they touched down. The newspapers were unloaded. New editions for Christchurch. Sports results. A young Alan Border makes his test debut for Australia, although the Kiwis probably left that bit out. The last stories of 1978. The cargo handlers worked efficiently, as cargo handlers do at 1 in the morning. and in a short while the Argosy would be ready to fly back northbound Christchurch to Blenheim, along that same Kaikoura coast, the same mountains, the same dark water. And at Wellington Air Traffic Control the screen still had returns to the south. Nairi Crockett had been listening through her sound recorder's headphones for the entire flight, not just to the cabin but to the radio. She'd heard every transmission from Wellington ATC, every radar call, every confirmation. She'd heard callers say the target had doubled in size. She'd heard Fogarty's voice change. And she told her husband she would not be getting back on that plane under any circumstances. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more deliberate than fear. A calculation made calmly and precisely by someone who had heard enough to understand exactly what the return flight would mean. They were going back along that coast, and whatever had been out there, whatever had been tracked by 2 radar systems and confirmed by the pilots, filmed by her husband, it was still out there. And so Nairi Crockett stood on the tarmac at Christchurch Airport at 1:30 in the morning of New Year's Eve 1978. And she did not get back on the plane. Her place was taken by Dennis Grant, a TV1 journalist based in Christchurch. Grant had heard the reports. He knew what had happened on the northbound leg, and he picked up his bag and walked up the steps. The Argosy took on fuel, and the crew prepared for departure. And somewhere over the Kaikoura coast, the returns were still on the screens, those ominous blips. 15 minutes into the return flight, the Argosy climbed through 2,000 feet. Below, the lights of Christchurch fell away, and ahead the black coast and blacker mountains of the Kaikoura ranges. They were barely clear of the city when it appeared. A row of 5 small bright lights. And behind them, or alongside, it was difficult to tell. There was something larger. Something that settled into position off the starboard wingtip with a precision that suggested it knew exactly where it wanted to be. It was round, luminous at the base. What appeared to be a translucent sphere above. Or perhaps it was just the way the light behaved as its upper edge silhouetted against the dark sky. Whatever the case, the pilots could see it from the cockpit. Grant was at a cabin window. Fogarty was describing it. His voice was steady now, in the way that comes from having already passed through fear and emerged out the other side. David Crockett again raised his camera and looked through the lens. What he later described, a spinning sphere with lateral lines around its middle, rotating, tracking the aircraft at exactly their speed and heading. Startup activated the Argosy search radar and set it to ground mapping mode, which would detect solid objects. For 4 unbroken minutes, the object appeared on the aircraft's own instruments, a solid return, right where they could see it. This was not a trick of the eye. This was not infracted light. For 4 minutes, the radar and the naked eye agreed conclusively. Again, Wellington Air Traffic Control confirmed the same return from the ground. The object tracked with them for 15 minutes across the Kaikoura coast, over the canyon, over the mountains. On the tape recorder, Quentin Fogarty spoke the now famous words that would follow him for the rest of his life. Let's hope they're friendly. As the Argosy approached Blenheim, 2 more lights appeared, one dropping suddenly, falling what instrument suggested was 1,000 feet, and then stopping, and then ascending in a series of short, jerky movements. Wellington again confirmed the manoeuvre on their screens. The Argosy landed at Blenheim at 3:10 in the morning. Crockett checked his film magazine and the footage was intact. They had it. Proof. Leonard Lee got Fogarty on a first-class flight back to Melbourne. He did not want the film on any other aircraft until it was in his hands. In a darkened editing suite back in Melbourne, Lee and Fogarty watched the footage unspool for the first time. Lights. Moving lights. Some behaving as lights do, but others doing things that lights, as Lee understood them, shouldn't do, couldn't do. Channel Zero broadcast it on their primetime news on New Year's Eve 1978. By the following morning, Walter Cronkite had called personally from CBS in the States, offering $5,000 for the film. The BBC had requested a satellite feed, and in Tokyo, reporters were already filing stories. The footage went, as one historian later described it, the 1978 equivalent of viral. Consumed by a public primed by Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, by the Valentich disappearance, by a decade of anxiety about what might be up there that we couldn't see or control. It was, at that moment in time, the most widely seen UFO footage in history. And in Wellington, John Cordy sat at his radar post, finishing the Afghan biscuit and the crossword puzzle, and waiting for someone to call him the first witness. But nobody did. New Zealand Prime Minister Robert Muldoon was personally briefed. The RNZAF put an A4 Skyhawk on standby and dispatched a P3 Orion surveillance aircraft over the Kaikoura coast on January the 2nd. It was the only UFO sighting in New Zealand history to receive a full Air Force investigation. The RNZAF's conclusion was 3 pages long. Natural but unusual atmospheric phenomena. Squid boat lights refracted by temperature inversions. They threw in a bit of Venus misidentification and some radar anomalies. A series of explanations cobbled together in a vain attempt to come up with something palatable, mundane. They did not interview John Cordy, the senior Wellington ATC controller who had spent hours tracking the returns while in direct radio contact with the cargo crews. Nor did they speak to Fogarty, the Crockett's, or Dennis Grant. Half the witnesses to the most documented UFO sighting in the Southern Hemisphere were simply never contacted during this investigation. Cordy, who remained justifiably bitter about this for the rest of his life, was direct with researchers when they eventually reached him. He said they weren't refractions or atmospherics, they were solid objects giving a radar return. We were in communication with the pilot as he described objects moving around him, and we could see those same movements on our screens in real time. The objects tracked that plane for 40 miles. And let's remember here for a second, this is a former RAF radar operator. At the time of the sighting, he'd spent 8 years as a senior controller in Wellington and decades prior to that watching screens. If you went searching for the most credible and experienced person to corroborate eyewitness testimony using radar evidence, then you'd stop looking when you found John Cordy. Each official explanation had a particular flaw. The squid boat theory, advanced by DSIR scientist Bill Ireland, required boats to be present in Pegasus Bay on the relevant nights. And yet Ireland's own search of fishery records found none registered in that location. Co-pilot Guard could see the actual squid fleet, and they were located separately far on the horizon. He also noted that the lights of the mysterious craft were different in colour and behaved differently from any fishing vessel he'd seen, and he'd seen plenty. The Venus explanation collapsed too when it was established that Venus wasn't above the horizon at the time of the primary sighting. The astronomer who proposed it shifted their story to Jupiter, which was nearly overhead, but that's also not at the angle where the lights appeared. Crockett later filmed Venus on subsequent nights with identical equipment. It appeared as a small white dot. It looked nothing like what was on that film. Captain Startup's summary of the investigation was polite and devastating. He said, "They've said it was squid boats, Venus, Jupiter, harbour lights, but they haven't explained why these things were doing 140 knots on my radar." There was one additional detail that's never been resolved. The Christchurch ATC audio tapes, recordings of the transmissions from the return leg from the most significant portion of the encounter, were reported missing within days. Dennis Grant lodged formal requests for years, and those tapes have never surfaced. Leonard Lee from Channel Zero sent the film to America, to a gentleman by the name of Dr. Bruce Maccabee. Maccabee held a doctorate in physics from American University and worked as a research physicist on the US Naval Surface Weapons Center in Maryland. He specialised in optical data processing. This was a well-credentialed scientist, working within a government defence establishment, and he was willing to look seriously at what the film showed. Maccabee spent 3 months analysing the footage. He travelled to New Zealand and Melbourne to interview every witness. He conducted frame-by-frame photometric analysis, brightness and luminosity calculations, and systematic correlation between the visual sightings and the radar data from the 3 independent sources. In other words, he conducted a real investigation. His conclusions were specific. Within a single frame, an exposure of 44 thousandths of a second, he identified a movement trail in the shape of a figure 8. Stop and think about that for a second. 44 thousandths of a second, completing a figure 8. He estimated the primary object at roughly 30 metres in diameter, at a distance of approximately 19 kilometres, with a brightness equivalent to a 350,000 watt incandescent bulb. The radar returns were not consistent with squid boats, planetary objects, or any atmospheric phenomenon he could identify. He published his analysis in the Journal of Applied Optics. The DSIR published a rebuttal, and Maccabee replied it. It remains the only debate about a specific UFO sighting ever conducted in a peer-reviewed technical journal. Proper scientific discourse. His conclusion? The light sources could not be explained by conventional means. Maccabee died in May 2024, and he'd not changed his assessment in 45 years. Quentin Fogarty came home from New Zealand, a celebrity he hadn't asked to be. Melbourne's tabloids labelled him the UFO reporter. The tag followed him. He was hospitalised for 2 weeks with nervous exhaustion after the broadcast. To be accused not merely of being wrong, but of deliberate fabrication, of hoaxing an encounter he had genuinely experienced. It cut him in a way that stayed with him. He kept working, believed to have been among the first journalists hired by SBS when it launched in Australia in 1980. And in 1985 he won a Logie Award for his documentary Frontline Afghanistan. He worked across every major Australian network, then moved into media training and public communications. He even served as a public affairs manager for the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission in 2009. And he wrote a book in 1982 about this incident called Let's Hope They're Friendly. Speaking to the New Zealand Herald on the 40th anniversary, he said, 40 years down the track, this is still unfinished business. Quentin Fogarty died on July the 5th, 2020 at his home in St Kilda, Melbourne. He was 73 years old. He'd retired from his media career the week before and was preparing to move to Perth to be near his son. His funeral notice read with the kind of warmth that can carry grief. Wherever he's gone, let's hope they're friendly. John Cordy gave a public talk at the Kaikoura Museum for the 40th anniversary in 2018. He was 85 years old. His assessment too had not changed in 4 decades. Those objects were real. The radar returns were solid. And the investigation was completely inadequate. In December 2010, New Zealand's Defence Force released approximately 2,000 pages of previously classified UFO files. The Kaikoura documents were among them, including a DSIR briefing to the United Nations that acknowledged particular difficulty explaining the footage from the return leg. Some documents remain restricted at Archives New Zealand until 2050. Dennis Grant, the journalist who got on the plane, who watched the orb track alongside them for 15 minutes, who saw it on radar and saw it with his eyes, was asked decades later whether he'd ever found a satisfactory explanation. He said, "I'm entirely sceptical of little green men. However, what we saw that night over Kaikoura was unidentified, and it still is. Some mysteries don't close. They just grow older." Next time on Struth, we come back to Australia, to Portland in Victoria, and to the most unlikely scene of a double murder, a hair salon. But before we go, a word about Struth Abroad and the premium subscription service that we're now offering. You've just heard our first episode exploring a mystery from overseas beyond Australian shores. Future Struth Abroad episodes will be exclusive to our premium subscribers. In addition to covering mysteries from overseas, premium members will also receive other exclusive content, including some listener tales, some Q&As, and some deeper dives into the cases that we cover on the show, and heaps more. There'll be an extra episode every single week. Plus, you'll also receive early access to ad-free episodes of the regular Struth feed. What more could you ask for? So check out the Patreon link in the description below if you want to get involved. There are 2 bonus episodes sitting in that feed already, so no time like the present. Thanks for listening, and thanks for all of your support, whether it be subscribing to our premium service or just sharing with a friend. Leaving a comment, all of that stuff makes a huge difference as well. So thanks a lot. I'll catch you all next week. Cheers.